Welcome back, everybody. This was quick, and this is the start of the whole Malazan knitting whatever thingy. And I decided to go book by book, not printed book, but books within the printed volumes. So this is Gardens of the Moon, book one, and I'll talk about it some more. But first, let's talk about the beer for today. And the beer for today is Kyla, which means boar. So this is definitely a Malazan beer because it's a full-on Fenner beer. And since I'm very partial to people like Stormy and Gesla, which we have not met yet, this is definitely my kind of beer. It's a Weiss beer at this point, and I know I should use a proper glass for that, but I wanted to show the bottle, and I'm too lazy to, actually pour the beer in front of the camera. Also, I'll probably fuck up when it comes to pouring beer. So, let's start this. Cheers. Refreshing. Now, as I said, this is about book one of Gardens of the Moon, which is volume one in the 10 very big books, the Malazan Book of the Fallen. And before we start, obviously, I need to show you all the knitting. And the first thing I'm going to do is knit a scarf, and it's going to be red. And this is how much I managed to knit during the first book, which is roughly 5.5 hours or something of knitting. It's, I don't know, good German sheep's wool as far as I know, and we'll see how much I'll get done in the next part, which will be book two, which is roughly, it's a bit shorter, so probably not that much, but you'll learn all about it. Anyway, what was I going to say about book one? Let's first talk about spoilers. I will try not to spoiler too much. Actually, I try not to spoiler at all, but I assume that at this point you have read book one of Gardens of the Moon. And I'll not, summarize it as such because I think that is rather pointless. If you want that, go over to Iskar Jarek's channel and watch his summaries, like chapter by chapter things. They are more, like, they're actually incredible and much better than I could ever do them. Also, he's more funny and he's funnier and everything, so go over and do that. I'll do something else. I'll try to point out things that I realized while reading it again. This is my third read-through of the Malazan Book of the Fallen. And I'll try to point out things that I found interesting, that I think might be helpful in like noticing or keeping in mind when it comes to continuing with the book, because as a lot of people claim, these books are dense, and there's stuff in there that I noticed on my third read through that I didn't notice on the second, and stuff that I noticed on the second that I didn't notice on the first. It's something that a lot of good books have, bad books not so much, but I feel that pointing out those things that I noticed this time round might actually help people who are in this for the first time to get an easier access and get an easier access to the books. I think once I've done all like the books of Gardens of the Moon, I'll do a full-on wrap-up video by well, probably in a couple of days, like 2, 3, 4 days. We'll see. Anyway, that's that. That's what I'm going to do. So I'll try not to spoiler anything that's beyond Gardens of the Moon. That's beyond book one of Gardens of the Moon. As such, there might be foreshadowings though, because this whole series is basically about foreshadowing and payoff later on. So yeah, that's what I'm trying to do. All right, so let's dive into that. First of all, we start with this sort of introduction thing about that basically tells you what you're in for. It's the sort of introduction to the Book of the Fallen. We'll find out more about that later. It's before the prologue. It tells you basically what you're in for. It's about everybody, it's about history, and it's about reliving things. So yeah, you should keep that in mind because it will be important. It's the Malazan Book of the Fallen will be not only, and even though the fireworks will be huge, funny thing I'm talking about fireworks because it's New Year's Eve today. Anyway, so even though it will be impressive, the power level will be really huge, but the person this is really about is the everyday person, the everybody. Keep that in mind while you're reading the book, and like look out for when these things come up again. It's also about history and learning from history, not learning from history, history influencing the present, the future, and so forth. So keep that in mind as well, and we'll see a lot of that in book one. Basically, book one is all about that. So that's the first thing that you'll notice. Then you have the prologue, which introduces two characters that we'll meet later on. It actually introduces three characters that we'll meet later on. The Empress, at that point she's not yet the Empress, and Whiskey Jack and Ganoa's Paran. We meet all those three characters that will play an important role later on. It's your typical fantasy prologue. Up to that point, oh yeah, we also meet Fiddler there. Really? Okay, yeah, so at that point, it's a typical fantasy prologue. If you've read fantasy before, this will not actually, give you, like, shock you or anything. This will sound familiar, in a way. It has elements that will become important later on, or not important, like the weather vane that has been pointed out by other people before will play a role, not a role, but will show up later on in a way. Again, it has those things. We already notice that the language is above a lot of other run-of-the-mill fantasy writing styles, but apart from that, it's your typical don't become a soldier, don't get noticed by higher powers because this will definitely fuck with your life, and so forth. We get that. We obviously have the young hero who is not taking this seriously and is obviously making what we already know will be a stupid or glorious idea, because it will definitely transport him, in this case him, Ganoa's Paran, into adventure, or so we think. That's the prologue. What do we see in chapter 1? And this is where we already have set up a lot of themes that will come up later on. It has been said before by several people. The Malazan Book of the Fallen is not so much a plot-driven narrative, it's more theme-driven. And we'll see some of those themes and in there a lot. Now, what I noticed this time round, the beginning of the scene at Itkokan with Sori and the wax witch and everything, one thing that is made extremely clear in there is that even a country that has, like it's later on described as pacified completely, with a very peaceful inhabitants that are firmly under the yoke of the Malazan Empire. There's no rebellion brewing in Itkokan or anything like that. But even those people who have been under Malazan rule for a long time are not really happy with being under the rule. That empire feeds or furthers rebellion, or that imperial overlord, no matter what they do, whether they bring civilization, whatever they do, they are not loved by the conquered and ruled people. That's something you see really clearly there. The arrogance of the troops when they beat the wax witch and everything like that. And what she tells Sori, who has a different name at that point, which we don't know, that she tells the girl, all of that is more a commentary on imperialism, colonialism, and so forth than anything else. And it's something you should keep in mind, because what's interesting in here is that during this first scene, like the first scene in the first chapter, not the prologue, the Malazan Empire comes across as the evil people, right? You read that, they are behaving arrogantly, they're striking down the wax witch, they're arrogant conquerors and overlords. not the nice guys, where, as we'll obviously find out that, yeah, it's not that simple, and we'll have to deal with a lot of people in that Malazan empire later on. Then we have the appearance of Shadow Throne and Cortillion, and the first appearance of the dogs, the Hounds of Shadow. I shouldn't call them dogs. That's kind of, yeah. Anyway, of the Hounds of Shadow, they go after. I'm doing something of a summary anyway, but this shows you is like Erickson is starting to show us that there is more in there, and it's that there is a level of brutality which will then be shown even clearer when Adjunct Lawn shows up for the first time and we meet Ganos Paran again. That yeah, this is not your happy first book of Shannara, Lord of the Rings, not Lord of the Rings, Hobbit, Stephen Lawhead, whatever fantasy. This is, I hate to use the word grimdark. I have to say something on the topic of grimdark at some point after I've watched a Ruth and Bud's video, which I have not done yet. Anyway, so we see that, yes, there is explicit violence and Erickson doesn't pull any punches. We see that in the first scene, like the first chapter as well, when the scene changes. We also see a bit of the whole idea of the Malazan Empire, Malazan army being mostly meritocratic and not exactly ruled by aristocrats and nobles that are on the top. When we meet the captain that is on old hand and veteran and so forth, we see all these things are slowly laid out, but at this point we don't know anything about the empire or anything there. Has often been, how can I say, like criticized of Erickson by some people, that he just like pushes you in at the deep end and you have to figure out stuff by yourself. But in general, that first chapter on my reread, I realized is relatively easily understandable how the topics are introduced. We learn about warrants, we learn about all these things, but it's made in a very like easy to follow way. That's the point that I'm trying to make here. So we see all of that in the first chapter. We meet Paran again. He's still arrogant, but he's gotten his first tempering. He is, yeah, trying to leave his noble heritage behind and becoming someone on his own, trying to be his own person. This is a topic that will come up later again when you look at the whole idea of the Malazan Empire, Malazan Book of the Fallen, dealing with the question of individuality or individuals versus predestined forces and so forth. Ganoas Paran is trying to be his own person. He has joined the military. He has done this against his father's wishes. He's trying to be on his own. And yeah, we see those like first themes that will come up later on. We see those set up. I guess that's more or less what I wanted to say. There's one thing that stuck out in the description of the, like at the beginning of chapter 1, when the girl, Sori, and the witch are watching the army passing by. And the description is interesting when it says that all the recruits, or not all recruits, all the soldiers, the men are looking fierce and everything, and the women are looking even fiercer. And this is kind of interesting on two levels. One, we already get shown that the Malazan army is not a male army or anything, but women have the same right to join the army and so forth. But I found this comment that they are looking even fiercer. I found this an interesting comment when you look at the whole idea of that, like real world idea, or not idea, but the fact that a lot of women that try to make it in male dominated jobs or fields or whatever have to try even harder and be more intense at what they're doing there than their male counterparts. I found this just an interesting comment that stuck out, that the female soldiers, the women look even fiercer than the man in that part. Anyway, I'm not going too deeply into that. I just wanted to point out that it stuck out. So chapter 1. Chapter 2 is interesting on a whole nother level, because we're getting into the point where Erikson ramps it up a lot. Because now we meet Tattersail, we meet the bridge burners again, well, some of them again and some for the first time, and yeah, the scale just amps up by a whole lot, because we get the whole Siege of Pale and everything that comes with that. Ain't it fun? Yeah. Like, for the rest of the book one, we see that. We get the big magic conflict with Anom and the Rake and Moonspawn. We start out with a basic low-level fantasy up to the point, yeah, there's portal travel, there's these monster dogs that kill 400 people and everything, but then you see flying mountains and one person mowing down hundreds, thousands of people with his magic and so forth, which is a level that not a lot of fantasy books display right in their second chapter. So we know that this is going to be different, or not different, but this is going to play on power levels that most traditional fantasy books only, show you in their later installments. But Erikson shows us this is ongoing. We're in the middle of a conflict, something that is really important. This is not the beginning of the story. This is the middle, or even the end of the story of the Malazan Empire at this point. We're dumped right in at the middle. The power levels are already extremely high. Oh, yeah, something that also stuck out that's interesting, when you look at the chapter beginnings, we have like those sources, those quotes that may foreshadow stuff that happens in the chapter or not. And one thing that I found interesting is that when you have those like more military history kind of things, not Gothar's Folly, but the first one about the history of the Malazan Empire and everything, you have that. When you look at the dates, the more polished and more distant they sound, the more, and also more positive in a way, of the Malazan conquest and everything they sound, the bigger the distance between the writing of the source and the actual events. It's like the first one's like, there's actually this like just cold like distance history that's written by someone who actually was born after the events. That's kind of the thing. There's like just a small detail that when you notice it from it like shows you a bit more about the world, I think. Speaking of that, the scene on the hill with Tattersail, there's a cool foreshadowing or a cool metaphor in there. When she stands on this hill and there's the empty armor of the soldiers that got killed lying around her. Now that's a metaphor that is that nicely parallels what is like how the Malazan Empire and the situation in Pale, or on the continent in general, on Genebakis, is described. The Malazan Empire at this point has been hollowed out. The actual people, that the heart of the empire, the old guard, is being killed, and it's being killed by treachery, maybe, when you have the scene of the battle and you see all of that. But when the High Mages, there's a lot of cleanup going on, and it leaves the Empire hollow, like the armor around Tattersail. Another thing that we find in there, which is really important, when we come to the whole compassion, empathy thing that will be overarching a lot of the time, the viewpoint character we have here, Tattersail, she's human. She's trying to hold on to her humanity, or not holding on to it. She's arguing about her humanity, about her feelings, about her emotions. Whereas other people like Hairlock, for example, are already pretty much beyond it in a way. Tayshran, obviously, Tayshran as well. Yeah, all of those. But the viewpoint is very much about a person trying to be a human being despite having reached an enormous age and level of power, which kind of falls into the background when you like sort of get Tattersail's thoughts and emotions, it's kind of easy to forget that she's like over 200 years old and has like, as Whiskey Jack then tells Fiddler, has actually done like has been offered the post of high mage, rank of high mage before, and has declined. She's this like contrast between humanity and being human and remaining human, and the extreme levels of power that you play with. That's something that will come up later again and again and again. And it's one of the main themes, once again, that is already shown here clearly. It's like, keep those things in mind, and it will make like jumping from narrative to narrative, from character to character, easier if you keep it, at least for me, that it does. So yeah, we see that with Tattersail, and that's something I find very like I found interesting this time around reading it. It's like how those things are foreshadowed. And I just thought the whole scene with the empty armor was a really cool metaphor or allegory. I don't know. It was a cool image for what is shown here in this next part of the first book, because what the first book does overall, and we'll see that clearly, is it shows the Malazan Empire is at we're dumped in at the end of a story. The second army is slowly dying out, the fifth and sixth also. The old guard is being removed or removing itself. All the other people, like, we find a empire at supposedly the heights of its power, but not all is well in there. What we also find already, and it's a thing that will be important here, it's a theme that I feel is in every military fantasy I've ever read: the constant fear or constant expectation of betrayal by the regular soldier, the skepticism, the distance between those in power, the power structure, and the actual regular soldier on the ground is something that drives military fantasy. I obviously have no experience of being a soldier, a veteran, so I don't know how actually realistic that is. Now, since it comes up a lot in the Black Company with Glenn Cook, who actually was in the military, I suspect there is some truth in it, that regular soldiers always feel their superiors, or at least the people making the really big decisions, are stupid and have no idea, and have been way too removed from the actual happenings on the ground. It's something that is shown in here. It's something of a trope of military fantasy, but it's also obviously, yeah, it drives a narrative. It's something that is familiar and makes it easier for us to get into. So yeah, that's something. I'm pretty much rambly today, I'm sorry. Anyway, the next thing that we find in there is like that not all is well within. There's rivalry between the different mages. We find out about that. We definitely get a lot of Tattersail's humanity, which makes her one of my favorite characters of the first book, definitely. How she's struggling with her humanity. It's just, yeah. We then get we get the introduction to the bridge burners. They're really cool, powerful, and scary. It's also interesting that for a lot of the time at the beginning, we only get shown those characters from the outside. Our entrance point, our viewpoint, is Tattersail, who has been made very human in a way. Before that, our viewpoint was Lon, showing us Paran and so forth, and it's interesting how like more relatable viewpoint characters show us people that we will then later on get as viewpoint characters again. And that's something to keep in mind, is like how this sort of continues like a chain of events. We then obviously get a foreshadowing with Paran in front of Hood's gate and everything like that. Keep in mind that there's someone that we that he will care for will have to die meaninglessly for his in exchange for his soul. We get a first like image of the gods or ascendants, how they enter the game. And this is something that is then also reflected in all of Tetrasail's reading of the deck, readings of the deck of dragons. The deck of dragons is extremely important in this first book. It shows up so many times. It is something interesting here. It is that it's portrayed more like a card game, actually, in a way. And for those who don't know, the German title of the overall Malazan Book of the Fallen is not a straight translation. In Germany, it's called Das Spiel der Götter, which means the game of the gods. Which kind of makes sort of a sense when you read just this first book. It obviously later on doesn't make that much of a sense, but yeah, it shows that that really powerful entities are playing a game that then is reflected on the mortal plane, and how that gets in there. We get a sort of introduction to a lot of things there. There's a lot of foreshadowing, obviously, in those times where Tetrasail uses the deck of dragons, and then yeah, we get like more of the feeling that the Malazan Empire is hollow within, and there is this constant expectation on this threat against the lives of the bridge burners, which will, after we've basically just seen them sort of from the outside in a way, will be our main focus in later chapters. This is sort of all the stuff we should, I think, need to keep in mind. Yes, we can see how Hairlock as a puppet becomes more and more insane, and this will definitely come up later on as well. But for book one, yeah, we get more pictures of the hounds being super brutal and killing tons of people and all of that, which is impressive fireworks. As I said, the level of magic, the level of actual action is ramped up really steeply after the first chapter. And it leaves us at the end of book one with the bridge burners minus Paran moving on to Darujistan, and we're all worried. At least I'm worried. We have seen some of the main themes cropping up already. The idea of like how the structure of an empire takes over and is hollowed out, how there is the struggling of the individual human being to keep their humanity in the face of all of this. We see all these elements cropping up for the first time, and I think it's important to keep those things in mind and see how they show up in later books. So yeah, that's it for book one of the Malazan Book of the Fallen. Not book one of the Malazan Book of the Fallen, but book one of Gardens of the Moon, which is then volume one in the Malazan Book of the Fallen. And I'll now retire and get into book two and do some more knitting, and yeah, we'll see how that goes, and then I'll talk more about what happens in Darujistan very soon. Cheers.